Achieving truly significant goals, those really big, complex ones, whether in life or areas like spiritual growth or mission,
Yeah.
it can feel incredibly challenging.
Oh, absolutely. Like you're pushing uphill sometimes.
Right. And it often seems like the forces against you are just bigger than any one person or even one group can handle.
Totally. And when you actually look at what drives that large-scale impact, especially in movements, the source material we're digging into today, well, it offers some genuinely fascinating insights.
Fascinating and maybe surprising.
Definitely surprising insights into what often gets in the way, and maybe more importantly, what really opens the door for big things to happen.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So this deep dive is based on sources talking about something they call unbranded kingdom partnerships and catalysts.
Yeah, it's a really interesting frame.
And it sounds like it pushes us to think differently about how collaboration, identity, how all that plays out when you're pursuing a shared mission.
That's the core of it. Our mission today is really to explore what these sources are telling us. What's the power in unity, in deep collaboration?
And specifically, this idea of shifting focus away from our own thing, right? Away from individual or organizational brands.
Exactly. Moving away from building our brand and focusing instead on a shared mission that's just, well, it's much, much bigger than any single one of us.
Okay. So right off the bat, the sources point out something that might feel, I don't know, completely counterintuitive, especially today.
You mean in a world that often celebrates individual achievement, highlights the organization's identity?
Yeah, exactly. It feels like that's the norm.
It does. But they make this really striking observation. Organizations that put a heavy emphasis on their brand.
Meaning like their specific church name or denomination or ministry logo.
Right, their particular identity. When they emphasize that heavily within a larger movement strategy, the sources say they often fall far short of their actual goals.
Wow. And they contrast this with
the experience of ministries and churches that partner really closely with others, even partners who are, quite different from them in maybe style or structure.
And what happens there, according to the sources?
Those who prioritize that kind of partnership, they experience an unprecedented level of fruitfulness. It's a stark contrast.
Okay, so why? Why does emphasizing the brand hurt, in their view?
Well, the sources break it down. They argue it turns the focus inward onto the organization itself.
Instead of outward on the mission.
Exactly. And that inward focus, it kind of dulls the drive for the actual mission, reaching people, seeing lives changed.
Makes sense.
And it also, they suggest, leads to these really superficial partnerships, the kind that can splinter easily.
Why superficial?
Because the underlying loyalty, deep down, is still to the specific group's brand, not really to the shared objective, the bigger mission.
So the key takeaway here from the material seems pretty stark then.
It is. While the sources are careful, they acknowledge that just being unbranded doesn't automatically guarantee success.
Right, it's not a magic bullet.
No. But trying to stay tightly within your brand's confines while you're attempting to replicate a large-scale movement process, the sources say that more often than not leads to failure.
That's a really powerful claim.
It is. And this inward focus, this emphasis on brand, sadly, it often feeds directly into another big problem the sources highlight.
Which is?
Division. Division within the Christian community, they state it quite directly. Division, dissension among Christians, churches, ministries. It's simply harmful.
And it does immense damage, they say, to our collective witness to the world.
Huge damage, which immediately brings Jesus's own words to mind, doesn't it? The sources reference John 13:35.
For Jesus tells his followers, "By this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." Love is the identifier.
Exactly, love. But the observation from the sources, particularly looking at the global north, is, well, it's quite tragic.
What do they observe?
That love is often not the first thing unchurched people associate with Christians.
Ouch. What do they associate then?
Instead, sadly, Christians are sometimes known more for what they're against than what they're for.
That's sobering. And the sources give examples of this division, don't they? Especially within the Protestant world.
Oh, yeah. Quibbling over things that, in the grand scheme, seem pretty small.
Like interpretations of baptism or communion.
Right. Or disagreements about the right church structure, debates over spiritual gifts, even theological ideas that, frankly, aren't core salvation issues, but they create these huge divides.
Arguments over worship styles, too, or building programs, things that maybe don't directly advance the core gospel mission.
Exactly. And the sources point out this isn't even a new issue. Jesus himself dealt with it.
With his own disciples.
Yeah. They reference that story in Mark 9 and Luke 9. John comes to Jesus and says, hey, we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop.
Why? Because he wasn't one of us. He wasn't part of their immediate group.
Right. And Jesus' response is so telling, isn't it? He says, do not stop him, for whoever is not against us is for us.
He wasn't worried about the guy's affiliation, just that good work was being done in his name.
Precisely. And the sources connect this directly to that human tendency we all have to promote our group, our church, our ministry, our denomination.
Which can easily slide into spiritual rivalry.
So easily. And unless we're truly challenging someone's core commitment to Christ, refusing to work together basically violates Jesus's command to love. And it goes against his prayer for unity in John 17.
That prayer in John 17, it's so powerful because Jesus links their unity directly to the world believing the Father sent him.
Exactly. He prays for unity so that the world might know. So division actively works against that primary purpose for the world to know Jesus.
So the message is pretty clear from the sources.
It is. Kingdom impact, true impact. It's only about God and about reaching lost people. It's not about us or building up our specific group.
And movements centered on people or attached to specific names, they actually take away from God's glory.
In the view of these sources, yes. Division is fundamentally opposed to kingdom values.
Okay, so if that's the problem, the division hurting our witness, hurting effectiveness, what's the alternative the sources push for?
They pivot really powerfully. They highlight the immense value of unity, but specifically unity and diversity.
Unity and diversity, not despite it.
Right. They state pretty clearly, God absolutely loves diversity. You just have to look at creation.
Yeah, from ecosystems to every unique person.
Exactly. And they point straight to the New Testament, to Paul's metaphor of the church as a body.
Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians. Lots of different members, diverse gifts.
And Paul says all these different parts are absolutely necessary for the body to function right. And crucially, this diversity actually contributes to the unity of Christ's followers.
And this idea isn't just for one local church, right? The sources extend it.
They apply it to the universal church. Look around, God has clearly blessed and worked through churches and ministries with wildly different structures, different theologies.
As long as they're orthodox, right?
Yeah, right, within orthodox bounds. But different practices on baptism, communion, different worship styles, all sorts of differences.
And the point they hammer home is,
since God clearly works through all these differences to build his kingdom, shouldn't we be willing to work alongside them too?
it's a strong challenge.
They even use the historical example of Israel, different tribes, different traditions, but unified by their common identity and worship.
So denominations could be like that, having traditions, but being united in the mission.
That's the idea they propose, united in the core mission and worship of Christ, even with different expressions.
Okay, so how does this play out in practice? Do the sources give examples of this kind of collaboration working?
They do, particularly drawing from global insights. They observe that in the Global South, organizations that, frankly, might not typically partner or even get along in North America, they often work closely together there. And they consistently see God blessing that process of cooperation. Real fruit comes from it.
And they specifically mention disciple-making movements, right?
Yes. And for clarity, the sources describe DMMs as these movements where disciples are rapidly making new disciples, starting new groups or churches, that kind of multiplication.
And these rarely start with just one group.
Almost never, according to the sources. It's rarely one organization trying to do it all alone.
They give that new generations example, right?
Yeah, it's pretty striking. Out of over 500 movement engagements they've been involved with in the Global South.
How many partners?
Typically, over 700 different partners are involved at any given moment.
700. That's huge.
It's a massive interconnected network, not a single branded operation.
But then there's that challenging observation they share, too, about Western funding.
Yes. Well, the sources call it tragic. Sometimes a Western denomination discovers these newly birthed churches coming out of a movement.
And they want to help.
They offer funding, maybe for pastor salaries or buildings, which seems helpful. But often there's a condition. The new churches have to formally join their specific denomination.
And what happens when they do that?
According to the sources, this action almost always stops replication and momentum. It just stalls the whole organic movement.
Why? Because the money changes things.
It takes away that inherent reproducibility, that self-sustaining nature. The denomination might think they're helping establish the church, but they inadvertently kill the multiplication process. Branding and external funding get in the way of the organic growth.
That's a really hard lesson.
It is. Maybe looking at a couple of case studies the sources provide can make these principles even clearer.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
The first one focuses on partnerships among Western workers. It features two guys, Judson and Steckbeck.
Okay, J. Judson. The sources say he was a Western missionary in Burma, focused on disciple-making movements,
That's right. And mentored by George Patterson, who's known for obedience-based discipleship.
which the sources define as focusing on immediately obeying Jesus' commands in the Bible and teaching others to do the same.
Exactly. Very action-oriented.
And Jay had an early key partner.
Yes, a Myanmar man known only as the Major. He actually became a believer by reading the Bible in prison, then sought Jay out for discipleship when he got out. That was foundational.
But Jay faced challenges.
Big time. Peer pressure from other missionaries against his movement approach, for one. And then a major personal health crisis, renal failure.
Wow. Which forced him to leave Burma.
Yeah, he had to be evacuated back to the U.S. urgently.
Okay, but here's where the story gets really interesting, right?
This is the amazing part. While Jay was back in the States recovering for 6 months, the movement in Burma didn't collapse. It didn't even pause.
It kept growing without him there.
It kept multiplying, from 7 churches to 11, then to 30 churches in just those 6 months. Totally independent of Jay's physical presence.
That's incredible. It proved it wasn't about him.
Exactly. It showed the movement wasn't dependent on one person or, their brand of leadership.
And around this time, he meets Steckbeck.
Right. Another Western worker, but serving in Israel and with a really different ministry approach. Sean focused on praying for people's needs, praying for healing, often in public places like markets, as a way to connect.
And Jay's reaction initially?
Pretty skeptical. The sources quote him saying, "Sean, I just don't believe in that." Their models seem totally different, maybe even incompatible.
But then something personal happened.
A pivotal moment. Jay's wife had this persistent infection. Nothing was working medically.
And Jay challenged Sean.
Yeah, maybe a bit cheekily. He said something like, "If this stuff you do is real, prove it. If God heals my wife, I'll change my mind about miracles."
And Sean prayed.
He took the challenge seriously. Prayed for Jay's wife right then and there.
And the result?
According to the sources, she immediately felt something like electricity and heat, and within hours, all signs of the infection were just gone.
Wow. Okay, so Jay must have been convinced.
His response was more than just convinced. It was remarkable. He didn't just acknowledge it. He immediately asked Sean to disciple him in matters of the Holy Spirit.
Seriously, disciple him.
Yes. And he even invited Sean to come to Burma to teach all of his movement leaders how to pray for healing and deliverance. That's humility.
That really is. And what about Sean?
Sean, in turn, saw an opportunity. He proposed a two-way partnership. He said, "Okay, I'll teach on prayer and healing if you coach and mentor me on how to replicate movements in Israel."
Ah, a genuine exchange.
Totally. The sources call it a perfect example of God's kingdom math, where 1 + 1 = 11. They even formed an organization together to facilitate this collaboration, supporting each other's very different gifts in their different fields.
And did it work? Did it lead to results?
Significant results. In Burma, the Buddhist background followers grew massively, from around 20,000 to 126,000 baptized believers in over 4,300 churches by 2017. And Sean's input on prayer was part of that picture.
And Jay's coaching helped Sean.
Yes, it helped Sean catalyze generational growth among 3 different unreached groups in Israel. It's a powerful picture of how different approaches, when united, can accelerate kingdom growth way beyond what either could do alone.
That's a fantastic story. Okay, what about the next case? Partnerships between Global South and Global North teams.
Right. This draws heavily on New Generation's experience as they intentionally work with both Global North, GN, and Global South, GS leaders.
And the sources are clear about who's most critical.
Absolutely. They state that the Global South leaders are consistently the most critical element in actually launching and sustaining these movements on the ground. They're the insiders.
So what's the role of the Global North leaders then? Strategic support.
Primarily, yes. Not usually direct leadership of the GS initiatives. They might be deeply involved in, say, gathering and supporting the GS catalyst teams, but the driving force comes from the local leaders.
And they learned some key lessons from these partnerships.
Several important ones. First, Cultural insiders, the GS leaders, are just vastly more effective as disciple makers in their own context. Makes sense, right?
Totally. And they're better at mobilizing local prayer, too.
Tend to be, yes. More effective at mobilizing local intercessors.
But the GN colleagues still bring value.
Definitely. They often bring valuable skills in areas like research, strategic analysis, planning, and also helping local leaders develop a bigger vision.
Bigger vision. Like seeing beyond their immediate area.
Yeah, especially for engaging completely unreached people groups, helping them see possibilities they might not have considered, kind of broadening the horizon.
Oh, what about resources? That came up earlier.
Right. So while the typical GN ministry models are often too expensive to replicate sustainably in the GF.
Yeah, that dependency issue.
Exactly. But GN missionaries can be effective at mobilizing resources for very specific, high-value projects that strategically support the GS-led movement without creating that dependency, supporting players, not the main funders.
So the sources really stress a mindset shift for GN workers.
Huge shift. Recalibrate the focus. Don't try to be the main actor. The essential role is finding, empowering, coaching, and then releasing indigenous leaders.
Becoming supporting catalysts and partners instead of prime movers.
That's the phrase they use. Become partners, not the ones trying to run the show.
And the conclusion from all this global experience is pretty clear.
Crystal clear, according to the sources. Genuine collaboration leverages everyone's strengths. And actively insisting on building your brand instead of collaborating, it just hinders movement progress, period.
This idea of collaborative strength, it really ties back to that concept of unity reflecting the Trinity, like Jesus prayed for in John 17.
It does. And the sources argue that living out that kind of unity requires deep, deep humility.
Humility how?
Valuing others above yourself, doing nothing out of selfish ambition, genuinely looking out for the interests of others.
Like Philippians 2 says about Jesus humbling himself.
Exactly like Philippians 2:2:11, living like Jesus who took on the nature of a servant.
So greatness in the kingdom isn't about building your reputation.
No, it's humble service to the bigger mission. That's what the sources emphasize.
And movements, they consistently show, are driven by teams.
Almost always. Teams connected by relationship with God and relationship with each other, working from a place of unity in the spirit. And God consistently blesses those kinds of strategic partnerships.
They give that example of Phil Butler and InterDev, right? Getting agencies to work together.
Yeah, a great example. He was hugely influential. The sources talk about this challenging first meeting he convened back in 1997.
What was challenging about it?
He brought together about 14 reps from different ministries, diverse, even opposing views on how to do missions, all focused on one huge unreached people group, like 60 million people.
Wow. High stakes.
And Phil posed this question: what is God's idea of a good market share? Kind of provocative.
I bet the atmosphere was tense.
Very. But the breakthrough came when they started listing tasks. They collaboratively identified 20 things that absolutely had to be done in that region for those people to be reached.
And the light bulb moment was?
Realizing these tasks could only be done if they worked together. No single group could do it all.
So that forced collaboration.
It did. They had to scale the list down. But that meeting started a process. It genuinely shifted dynamics. InterDev helped create this new default where strategic collaboration became a priority, not just a nice idea.
And the sources see that as more than just efficiency.
Oh, yeah. They describe it as a unique releasing of the Holy Spirit when God's people work together like that for a common goal.
This leads to another really powerful clarifying question, doesn't it? From Dr. Paul Gupta in India.
Yes, about the challenge in India. Needing 1 million churches to effectively reach the country. Just an overwhelming number for any single group.
Impossible for one group.
Totally impossible. So he presented what the sources call 2 mutually exclusive questions. You have to pick one.
Okay, what are they?
Question 1, do you want to reach your community area? Or question 2, do you want to see your community area reached?
Oh, wow. The difference is subtle but huge.
It's profound. The first one, do you want to reach it? The sources argue that's fundamentally about building your empire, your brand, your organization.
Getting the credit, maybe?
Yeah, perhaps. But the second question, do you want to see it reached? That requires a totally different posture. A willingness to work with absolutely anyone God is using.
Because, as they quote W. Allen,
kingdom growth cannot have your brand on it. You can't put your label on something that big and that diverse.
Allen adds more too, right?
Yeah.
About getting yourself out of the equation.
Yeah, he emphasizes that the real key to multiplication isn't controlling it, but actually removing yourself from the center. envisioning a future where the work grows without your personal or organizational control.
And he notes that nobody fully understands a whole complex context like India anyway.
Right, even after centuries of work there. So the kind of leader needed for this kingdom impact.
Is someone humble enough to say, we can't do it alone?
Exactly. Leaders willing to say, you're right, we need help. Leaders who unleash others, trust them even if they might fail sometimes, and stand behind them.
Like an architect signing off on a building. Or like Jesus with his disciples.
Precisely. And the sources insist movement leaders have to actively make themselves dispensable, mentor deeply, then get out of the way quickly.
Because trying to control it kills it.
Kills a movement, yeah. But opening it up, letting God lead through diverse partners, that allows it to develop organically and powerfully.
Okay, there's one more case study, right? Pastor Juan Pablo.
Yes, a really inspiring story of a pastor in Sonoma, California, who started out discouraged, but then grasped this kingdom mindset.
Discouraged why? What was his initial measure of success?
Building the largest church in his city. And he wasn't achieving it, so he felt like a failure. He hit a wall, entered this season of intense prayer and fasting.
God gave him an unusual instruction.
Seemingly simple, but remarkable. Start praying specifically for other Christian leaders in his region.
Not just his own church leaders.
No, leaders across all denominations in Sonoma County and beyond. He obeyed, even though he didn't really get it at first.
And around the same time, he reconnected with a DMM leader.
Yeah, Ricardo Pineda. Juan shared what was going on, this new focus on praying for others, and Ricardo introduced him to obedience-based discipleship principles.
And that resonated with Juan's new focus.
Deeply. It clicked with that outward-looking perspective God was giving him.
But his own church wasn't necessarily on board with changing.
Not particularly interested in radical change, no. But Juan kept obeying God's leading. He started meeting and praying regularly with these other pastors across denominations for their whole region.
And they got creative. Prayer flyovers, anointing oil drives.
Yeah, creative ways to express unity and focus on the bigger picture, seeing their communities reached by making disciples who make disciples.
And they started training together too.
Juan and Ricardo began training pastors from various traditions in these obedience-based methods, how to launch discovery groups.
Simple Bible study groups focused on obedience.
Exactly, where people discover truths for themselves and commit to obeying. And some pastors started implementing it right away. Over a few months, several key pastors, many others from different denominations, started launching groups with coaching from Juan and Ricardo.
They also used community service strategically.
Yes. Things like Thanksgiving events, medical programs, not just as one-off good deeds, but as ways to find receptive people of peace, and build real relationships outside church walls, praying for the sick, showing love tangibly.
And there were specific examples of partners impacted.
Like Pastor Nelson.
Right. Pastor Nelson was totally discouraged, ready to quit because 40 people left his church.
Ouch.
But Juan challenged him. Shift your focus. Look at the 10,000 lost people in your community, not just the 40 who left.
How did Nelson respond?
He got energized, totally changed his perspective, started launching discovery groups immediately at 17 people in a week, and his church started DGs in really diverse settings, even with Catholic sisters starting Bible studies in their parishes.
Wow. And Angela, another leader. She successfully taught people how to find people of peace, launch DGs outside the church structure. Some in her traditional church resisted, but Ricardo and others encouraged her church to become like a regional equipping center, training others across denominations.
And the impact just kept spreading.
Exponentially. Angelica launched DMMs in Guadalajara, Mexico, saw 4 generations multiply, and it even spread back into the U.S. Midwest.
And Juan took this to Cuba?
Yeah, launched training there with another leader, Norlin. The result? Over 5,000 groups and churches started in just 3 years. Some reached the 9th generation of multiplication. Astonishing.
Incredible. And he's using this in a recovery center now.
Still applying the same DMM principles, seeing lives transform there too.
And his reflection is powerful.
It really is. He basically says, once you taste the fruit of this kind of kingdom transformation in people, in communities, there's just no going back to traditional ministry focused on building your own little box.
So the conclusion from Juan's story, for the sources,
is that when you become genuinely more concerned with God's kingdom advancing than with your own reputation or your group's size,
and you prioritize supporting and empowering others,
a powerful spiritual momentum enters the picture that just wasn't there before. God moves in a new way.
Which connects right back to that scriptural math we mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Leviticus 26.8, 5 chase 100, 10 chase 1,000. But then Deuteronomy 32.3 deal ramps it up.
1 puts 1,000 to flight, but 2:0 put 10,000. Exponential increase.
And Psalm 133 gives the reason why, doesn't it?
Behold, how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. God commands a blessing there.
He commands a blessing specifically where brethren dwell together in unity.
Maybe that's a key reason Jesus sent them out 2 by 2. Not just for safety, but for that synergistic power.
Very likely. The sources argue that when leaders, like pastors in a town, are actively praying for and supporting each other across divides, it just lifts the whole spiritual climate for everyone.
Allows for much greater kingdom impact than they could ever have competing or ignoring each other.
Absolutely. So, for those of us, maybe especially in the global north, where division can feel so common, so ingrained, the sources offer some really practical steps.
How can we actually start developing these cooperative, kingdom-focused ministries?
First, and it sounds basic, but it's fundamental, start with prayer.
Pray for what specifically?
Pray for a genuine movement of God in your area. Pray for a kingdom vision that's bigger than your church. And pray specifically for cooperative alliances to form, regardless of who gets the credit.
Okay, prayer first, then what?
Actively use things like existing minister meetings or create new spaces to find potential partners. Look for other leaders who share that kingdom vision and seem willing to collaborate.
Be intentional about finding partners.
Very intentional. And then utilize those access ministries serving community needs, food drives, tutoring, whatever it is.
But not just as projects.
Right. Use them strategically to build relationships. With other churches involved, sure, but crucially with the unreached people in the community. Build ongoing connections, show genuine love. Don't just make it a one-off event.
Relationships, not just programs.
Got it. And then share everything you learn with your partners. Be totally open, transparent.
You give away your knowledge.
Yeah. The sources suggest the more you give away, the more God seems to work through the group collectively. Plus, it releases suspicion that you're just trying to build your own thing under the guise of cooperation.
Makes sense. Anything else?
Finally, just be patient. Building real, deep, trusting relationships between different churches, different ministries, it takes time. It takes consistent effort. Don't expect it overnight.
Okay. So, wrapping this deep dive up, it really feels like we've underscored this central, pretty transformative idea from the sources.
Yeah, this incredible, almost exponential power that gets unleashed for God's mission.
When individuals, when organizations are actually willing to set aside their own brands, their own agendas.
And instead choose humility, choose collaboration, choose unity, focusing entirely on that shared mission, a mission directed towards God and reaching people who don't know him yet.
Yeah. The sources give us the biblical reasons, the practical examples from all over the world, these really striking personal stories.
And they all point the same way, don't they? Focusing on seeing it reached together is just exponentially more fruitful. And it honors God more than trying to reach it alone or worrying about who gets the credit.
It really challenges that individualistic or competitive mindset.
Deeply challenges it.
So maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on as you process all this.
Given this clear message from the sources, this emphasis on the power of collaborative, unbranded kingdom work, how might this challenge you?
Yeah, how might it challenge you to maybe reevaluate where you focus your energy, your time, your resources, right there in your own sphere of influence?
What might God command a blessing upon? What kind of spiritual momentum might be unleashed if you really prioritized unity, humility, and genuine collaboration for the bigger picture of his kingdom?
Rather than maybe defaulting to focusing just on the growth or the recognition of your own particular corner of the work. Something to definitely think about.